First off, I would like to thank Congressman Tauzin for that fantastic note that resonated with all of us. And we will continue the conversation. So I'm also thankful that we have three panel members who joined us today. And I'm going to just mention the names, and I'll ask them to introduce myself. They probably do a much better job than I do. So we have Steve Miller, Chief Medical Officer at Express Scripts. And we have, I just want to get the name straight. Brian Harvey is VP US Regulatory at PFIZER. And we have Steve Phillips, who's the Senior Director of Health Policy at Johnson & Johnson. And of course, we have Congressman Tauzin here. So let me start off by, the name of the session that we have here is, how has the political climate affected drug development and delivery, and how is the industry coping? And let me just tee up the issue in saying that not only has the elections and the political climate is having an impact on how the industry needs to adapt, but also the regulatory policies are changing. The expectations from payers are changing, and so many other players things are in play. And not to mention that most companies are going global, and so it's not just about the U.S. anymore. It's a global policies that companies have to adapt to. So maybe I can start from that end with Steve Miller and ask him to introduce himself and have a few words on those.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So. As you heard, I'm with Express Scripts. I'm a transplant kidney doctor by training. I was doing primary drug discovery and actually hold a bunch of patents with people's companies in this room. For many years, I was the Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Washington University and Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis, a number 3 med school, number 6 hospital. Thought I had one of the best jobs in healthcare. And then 7 years ago, joined Express Scripts. And the reason there is, with my frustration with healthcare, it was a better platform to try to change the system. At Express Scripts, we represent payers, essentially, but we have 100 million patients. So we have 30% of the US population who were making the choices on their pharmacy services. And so it gives us a great look at what's happening across the country and give us great perspective about what's going to happen both with healthcare reform, but also all the great things you're all doing. We, as you know, our model, we like low-cost drugs, so we like generics, but we are not in business unless we have branded products. And so we find ourselves straddling the fence. We want more branded products. We want to have great inventions coming into the marketplace, but we also want to save money wherever there's an opportunity so that we can pay for those new products coming to the marketplace.
Hi, and I'm Brian Harvey, and I want to thank you for the invitation. I mean, originally, our head of R&D was supposed to be here today, but based on the biomarkers, I was the generic equivalent, so I'm here instead. But I started life as a PhD biochemist in the lab, and then during the Reagan years, when he was slashing the NIH budget, I figured I better go to trade school, so I went to medical school. And after time at internal medicine at Harvard and gastroenterology at Johns Hopkins, met David Kessler, who invited me to the FDA. So after 12-year sentence, I was let off for time for good behavior, and first went to Sanofi, and now I'm at PFIZER, and head of U.S. regulatory.
You want to say a few words about how the regulatory policies are going to have an impact?
It's amazing, because we hear so much about regulatory science. And I don't know if anybody really knows what regulatory science is. And when you ask the FDA, what is regulatory science? They go, well, what do you want it to be? Yeah. So I think it's still an open question. We lived through the recent PDUFA 5 legislation. Originally they called it FDASIA, but then of course it sounded too much like Fantasia, which actually I think was insightful. And so now they call it FDASIA at the FDA. But no matter what you call it, I'm not sure, it's going to be, time will tell to see whether or not it really has an impact, because it's not the drug review process we're worried about, it's the drug approval process. A submission to the FDA doesn't help the patient. It's bench to bedside, not from concept to complete response letter. So I think it's still an open question, and we'll see what happens.
Hi, my name is Steve Phillips. I'm a senior director with Johnson & Johnson's health policy team within the Government Affairs and Policy office within in the Washington, D.C. Office. And I have been with Johnson & Johnson since 2005 and working on many of the issues recently that the Congressman spoke of, and just wanted to say thank you for your leadership. And when you described what the world could look like today, you know, it looks a whole lot better than it could. That's for sure, with all of the challenges that we face. Before I joined Johnson & Johnson, I worked with Medicare's. I had the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I oversaw the physician payment area before for the last couple of years. When I was there, and worked in oversaw the hospital payment policies before that. And I guess it's safe to say, and the Congressman describing changing from Democrat to Republican, you know, I was often asked at the time when I left, you know, being a government bureaucrat, to working in industry, both sides of that. You know, how does it feel to have joined or left the dark side or joined the dark side? And you know, I always felt like, you know, that you know, while it's humorous, you know, it shows a real misperception that you know, I always felt that in both positions was really working, you know, to provide health care for people who needed it, and you know, I certainly, you know, have play a different role, but work on the same issues. And so I think that there's, you know, while there are challenges, you know, I'm excited about, you know, the developments in science and trying to shape policy in a way that brings those to the patients.
Stephen, don't feel bad. When I changed from Democrat to Republican, Senator John Breaux officially declared that I was a transvestite.
I never caught that.
Let me comment a bit on your question. These are the real experts, but having worked with the FDA and having had them under our jurisdiction in commerce for a long time, what I think is really part of the problem is that the real science is moving at a much quicker pace than the FDA can possibly catch up to. And that's a tragedy. And you know, every FDA commissioner that I've talked to over those years has tried to change that, has tried to upgrade the capacity of FDA to handle an application and to go to approval. I think we probably have to really start thinking about not just change, but sort of revolutionary change at the FDA at this point. I think we have to look at the incredible emergent sciences that teach us so much about the genetics of disease and the genetics that are going to have to guide the kinds of treatments and medicines we use on people. There's a reason why medicines work with one person and the other. We don't know why. And once we know why, we need a regime at FDA that allows us to do clinical trials on the category of people for whom a medicine is more likely to work, and to use that information to get to a faster approval and perhaps some, maybe even conditional approval that gets it out in the market and lets the science of data collection tell us what, if any, problems exist, so that we can go back to the lab, if you will, fix those problems and reintroduce a product with those problems amended. There are ways to think that through. We haven't done that yet. And I would love to see the great pharma companies sitting down with some of the leaders in the regulatory field and in the Congress and really think sort of out of the box for something new. And you guys can help do that. I hope you do.
And along the same vein, you know, the paradigm is shifting in the sense that there's because of the payer expectations, because of all the changes in the healthcare policies, the you know, showing value for the product has become of paramount importance, and outcomes-based development is where the industry is going.
Stephen's CEO even rose at a pharma meeting one day and said, you know, maybe it's time we think like the auto industry.
Right, yeah.
Maybe we need to give a warranty on our products.
Right.
And we only get paid, or we get paid more if our product worked better and less if it doesn't.
Right.
There's new formulas of reimbursement that could emphasize new systems for approving and for managing drugs after approval.
Right, and so is that the part of the change at the FDA where you create a process to discuss outcomes even before approval, as opposed to, talking about it, post-approval, because the outcomes versus approval is somewhat, disconnected in many cases. Is this something that's going to evolve as one and the same?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. That I think that things are moving that way, and from most of my experience and focus is on the payers, but I think that what is driving even upstream with the FDA is the increasing involvement of payers, CMS, and also outside the U.S. Parallel review of the process, and really the trying to take into account and the payers really enforcing that issue, as products go through the regulatory review, thinking about what value it is going to bring. And it's we feel that it's it is a good focus, but with always in these complicated areas, things can get off track, and so that's something that we have some concern about, that the balance gets skewed towards the focus on the payers' interests, which again can kind of hinder the process of regulatory review and create a hurdle rather than a barrier. But there's no question that value and what value products are bringing to market is playing an increasing role, and to the extent that we can make the process function better and looking at that as things are going through and make it more efficient, and that works for the better for everybody.
And I think to build on that, I think outcomes research can be a very powerful tool, but if it's done badly, it could actually be an incredible obstruction. And I think a wonderful example of that is in the early years of blood pressure medicines. At the time, all you needed to show was that a blood pressure medicine dropped blood pressure to a safe level. It wasn't for about 10 to 15 years that there was finally outcomes data that reduced the risk of stroke, or reduced the risk of heart attack. It actually could survive prolonged survival. But in this day and age, if those medicines were coming along and they actually had to show outcome, we'd be looking at much longer trials. Right. And so I think having faith in a surrogate endpoint, or having faith in a biomarker. FDA has all these wonderful conferences and guidance documents about biomarkers, and yet they're still arguing about cholesterol and whether or not that's a good marker. They're still arguing about hemoglobin A1C for diabetes, and saying that a diabetes drug not only has to lower the sugars, but has to show that it doesn't have a negative impact on cardiovascular health and outcomes. So, they're really, it's almost as if there are two FDAs. Sometimes people talk about the Roman god Janus with the head that looks two ways, and they have all these great initiatives and regulatory science and biomarkers, but the other one was, you're still not going to get approved. So it'd be nice to have the right face, which is the one that gets the products to patients. But the memorandum of understanding between CMS and FDA is just the first step, and I think it's good that they talk. I think it's good when the endpoints get put into the clinical trials, but if that then becomes a barrier to approval at FDA, that's going to add more time for patients who may not have that time.
I'll add just one quick point as representing the payer here on the panel. Yeah. That is, outcomes-based payment for drugs has been tried. It's not working very well, and it's mostly being abandoned. What people are looking for the future is total cost of care. That is, instead of looking at an outcome, so there's only a few drugs that have a short-term outcome that allow you to make payment decisions based on it. The vast majority of the drugs you all are working on have longer outcomes, and so, as Brian pointed out, it's not practical to try to actually make payment based on that. Whereas what's important for you all, especially the device makers in the audience, it's the total cost of care experience. And so if a product is more expensive, but it lowers the total cost of care because people are more adherent to the drug's being used the right way, then that should be taken into consideration. So it should be the total cost of the experience instead of just looking at short-term outcomes.
There's another element, though, Stephen, that I think we can't overlook, and that is that, we know drugs get approved because they have a positive effect on a certain percentage of the population. There's going to come a day when we're going to know exactly why that's true. Lilly is here. Lilly's got a great drug for sepsis that is extraordinary medicine for about 1/3 of its patients. Doesn't affect the other 2/3. One day our scientists are going to be able to tell us why it worked for that 1/3 and why it didn't work for the other 2/3. And then maybe Lilly scientists can come back and amend it so it does work for the other 2/3. We don't know. But the point is, we tried to explain that to President Obama one time in a meeting in the White House. He didn't get it. But having authored a personalized medicine bill himself, we thought maybe you ought to think about that. If you can only provide, as a payer, medicine specifically to that 1/3 for whom you know it'll work, and maybe for a gray area where it might work, you can save a lot of money by not selling it to people for whom it won't work. There are great efficiencies and savings for payers if we do this right, as well as perhaps reward for manufacturers who can then take that lesson and go back and perfect their medicines.
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a big platform where we're actually doing gene testing on patients to both help the companies bring their products to the marketplace, but also recognizing that this era of personalized medicine is here. It has been phenomenally powerful, especially in the cancer field where we're further along with it. But it actually is going to impact all fields. Blood pressure is a great example. Something as common as hypertension, yet there are many patients that still go on to stroke or have heart attacks because we either are putting them on the wrong agent or we actually don't understand that person's blood pressure well enough. So we are fully supportive of the era of personalized medicine and think that that's actually going to be a huge advance forward in both controlling costs, but more importantly, better outcomes.
In fact, Clayton Christensen, in his book, we talked about this earlier, guys, actually recommended that the pharma companies actually include a diagnostic element within their corporate structure, because diagnostic clinical trials are going to become the way in which, hopefully, to shorten the time for approval, the testing, and eventually to apply the drugs more properly to patients for whom they work.
And going back to your comment about showing total value, cost value, and that's clearly one of the things from a drug delivery standpoint is what we bring, extending duration of action, lowering frequency of administration, increasing patient compliance, all resonates very, very well. And I can tell you one of the things that from my own experience, and we heard David Pyatt talk about glaucoma medications, where compliance is a big issue. And if you ignore it, the disease is going to progress, and it's going to increase the cost of care downstream. And so all it takes is a simple discipline of taking your medications regularly, right? And so one of the things that we are, as he pointed out, one of the things we are trying to do is come up with a drug delivery, sustained delivery medication. So you take that component away from the patient. So you actually control the disease. The issue was how do you then show the value of compliance? Is compliance really a problem? Where does that data exist? And what we found out was that the data does actually exist, with hospitals and many other places. And so my question is, so one of the things we found out was that we have to have access to those databases. So we need obviously some sort of a collaboration with organizations outside of companies. Sometimes it's pharmaceutical companies may have, other companies may have it. So do you see that kind of collaborations increasing between pharmaceutical companies? And the Congressman Tauzin, as a pharma CEO, you may have a better view on this as well, is do you see that kind of collaborations increasing in order to consolidate this data so the industry as a whole can benefit?
Well, start off with the notion that there are new systems being developed to allow collaboration of data without necessarily giving up the proprietary nature of that data, and to do it into a trust sort of network where it's HIPAA compliant and there's no privacy concerns. So there are new systems that are going to permit companies to share information and to and literally to cross-current a lot of research. In fact, NIH is moving in that direction very rapidly in its grant programs to make sure they're not just granting 5 different people the same challenge and those 5 people aren't talking to each other. They really want to create systems where data is exchanged and examined across investigatory fields. I think companies are going to adopt that strategy. All the companies I know are suffering in their pipeline structure. They're desperate to have more products developed. They're going to find innovative ways to do that. And as fierce as competitors there are, they can get past antitrust problems. I think they're going to find ways to collaborate like that.
And I think a great example of that is at the Critical Path Institute out in Arizona, where sort of an offshoot of some of these ideas. They have this coalition against major diseases, and the CAM project is going to all the major companies that have done research in Alzheimer's disease.
Yes.
And what they have done is they have gotten the control group, the placebo group, which wasn't treated with any active therapy, and collected that data to have a super database of Alzheimer's patients. And by using that database, they're trying to use it for validation of biomarkers. And at some point, we're hoping, FDA willing, that then can be used as part of a clinical trial where that's the placebo group, and then all you have to do is study the active comparator group. So I think efforts like that are important. But these problems, Alzheimer's and other areas are getting so big, even a company like PFIZER needs partners. And I think to amplify on what you said, the global cost is really such a positive trend. Recently, we partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb to bring Eliquis to the market. And that's a product that in a clinical trial was shown to be superior to Coumadin. Now, of course, if you look at Coumadin, that's generic, it's dirt cheap, and Eliquis is much more expensive, but it's the fact that they don't need to have their testing that's done in traditional Coumadin therapy, and there was a decreased risk of major bleeds, the overall cost has been reduced. So under this global model, you can show that. But if you were strictly looking at the cost of X and the cost of Y, Eliquis would have lost out. So it's a positive trend for that innovative area.
Yeah, I'm just going to add briefly to that that one of the areas that our office has been involved over the last several years is the effort has been underway, at a policy level in Washington to encourage the development of electronic health records, health information technology, and looking at ways to make networks interoperable and how to manage all of the data that's already being generated and is only going to increase exponentially. But it is a area that our R&D teams are also very interested, just as you begin to develop the biomarkers and laboratory results that will now be or eventually much more accessible. But then you've got the balance there as well with privacy and concerns about who will have access to this data. So lots of policy issues there, but I think the looking at it as the potential again to get efficiencies out of the process of bringing drug development and bringing them to market is a real opportunity.
Yeah, we need to stress that a little bit, Steve. I'm sure many of the audience know this, but when you've got a process where you file your patent even before you begin doing your clinical trials and your patent time is running, and it takes you 15 years to get all your approvals, your clinical trials accomplished. You got 5 years left of patent life, and you've spent $1.5 billion in the process of your company resources. We've got a system that's about to break down, and even that patent law was threatened in the last few years by the high-tech industry that was worried about patent trolls. Yeah. On the other side of the, if you will, the plaintiff defense table in the courtroom. And we were able to protect against some serious damage to the current patent laws. But look, we in this country have to think about that. I wasn't kidding. We protect silly little products with 20 years of protection, and we end up with a 4 or 5 year protection system for a great cancer drug. There's something wrong with that. And Americans don't know that. Americans think, when these companies invest all this money, that they got as long a patent protection period as some toy that might be produced for Christmas. It's not true. And it's a model that's getting crankier and crankier every day. And sooner or later, people are going to be developing drugs somewhere else where patent laws are better than here in America. We need to think about that.
Well,
I'll just add a couple things. One is, with the consolidation of companies, data is actually more accessible than ever. As I mentioned, we have the pharmacy on 100 million lives now. We've never had that collection of data before. And when you think about the quality of data, there's actually two high quality sources of data. One's pharmacy, because it's all electronic, and the other is laboratory. When you have physicians entering notes or other people entering notes, the quality of that data actually rapidly deteriorates. And so for those of you who are interested in doing trials, having that good pharmacy and laboratory data, and now that we actually have a grid system that works, having access to that data and being able to do trials is actually in some ways easier. As a result, if you think about it, we have 5,400 drugs in human trial right now.
How many?
5,400.
5,400.
In no time in my 30-year career have we had more drugs in the pipeline than we have now. And despite what you're hearing, the FDA approved more drugs last year than any time since 1998. And so we actually have, and so the system's going to break. I agree with you 100%, because the FDA is not at all prepared for what's coming through the pipeline. And the trouble is, what's coming through the pipeline is absolutely stunning. It is some really spectacular agents for many areas of healthcare that we've never been able to address before, be it Alzheimer's, cancers, 1,600 drugs alone for rare diseases. And so when you think about how we're going to be able to change healthcare, and so the points you're bringing up are crucial. If we don't fix the FDA, these things don't get out into the marketplace. If we don't fix our ability to do clinical trials, they don't get out into the marketplace. And if we don't fix the total cost of this, it's irrelevant if they get out in the marketplace, no one's going to be able to afford it.
And the reason you have so many orphan drug trials going on is because we have special laws to speed the process.
Right.
Why don't we apply more of those special laws to more inquiries across the span of disease? Stephen, I mean, we ought to start a campaign in America to make people aware of how critical that is. Really, really.
Great.
Well, and I think it's an important point. I mean, most Americans who are not scientists don't know how long it takes to develop a drug. This year we had something called tofacitinib, which was approved for rheumatoid arthritis, and it got through FDA and got approved. And around the same time as it was getting approved, in the lab in Groton, Connecticut, where it was invented, they had a birthday party because it turned 20, because it was discovered in 1992. And so 20 years from the time it was discovered, it finally got approved at FDA. So the lab scientists were having their birthday party, and us in regulatory were having our party. But it's just, most people don't realize it's 20 years, and that's one that worked. I mean, the numbers that never make it through or never see the light of day. And of course, when you're marketing a product, you have to then recoup the costs of all the ones that never made it out of the lab or failed somewhere along the clinical trial pathway.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I've been out for a while, but the last number I saw is that 80% of the drugs that are being used in America are now generic. We're down to about 20% patent products. Is that about right?
It turns out that if you look at dispensed drugs, 80% are dispensed or generic. If you look at cost,
yeah, that's a different issue.
The reality is that it's still 60% of all drugs the cost of drugs are still branded.
It's still patent costs.
Correct.
But nevertheless, I think last time I looked, America has the highest, or among the top 3 highest generic drug utilization numbers in the world.
We do, but it's hard to compare across the countries, because remember, in Europe, with tendering, they can actually get the generic price on a branded product often, and so they don't have to dispense a generic because they can just force the price. Part of the problem, and you brought this up before, is as we go through healthcare reform and the government becomes a bigger payer, you're going to be seeing more and more aspects like the European system. And the fear I have for everyone in the room is that we are the seat of innovation for pharmaceuticals. So while America is 6% of the population, we're 25% of the GDP, we're a third of world healthcare spend, and that world healthcare, we are fueling both devices and pharmaceuticals. If you take the US out as that engine, there is no other country out there that's going to step up to pay to fuel that. And what you'll see is a radical slowing of innovation.